Hey guys, so today we are moving on and we're going to be looking at genetics in humans. So genetic studies in humans. Uh, genetic studies in humans are kind of hard to do. So we often use what are called pedigree charts. So these studies are hard because you can't do controlled breeding studies in humans like you could, for example, with Mendel and his pea plants. And there's lots of reasons for that. One, ethical reasons. Two, humans produce a fairly small number of offspring and have a really long lifespan, so it's just not feasible to conduct a lot of genetic studies in humans. And so instead what we do is we use pedigree charts to track somebody's family history for certain traits. When we make a pedigree chart, we have certain symbols that we use. So males are always going to be represented by a square, females by a circle, and then anytime you're trying to indicate that somebody has the trait that you're looking for, you just color in either their square if it's a male or their circle if it's a female, and that indicates a person with the trait of interest. So here we have a sample pedigree chart. So we have one male who is the father here that has the trait. He and the mother have 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. The fact that these 2 girls are coming from the same spot on the pedigree chart means that they are twins. So here we are looking at pedigree charts for a dominant trait versus a recessive trait. The dominant trait that we're looking at is widow's peak. So you can see here a person in every generation has the widow's peak. So this is a dominant trait, so you only need to be heterozygous for the capital W for that dominant allele in order to have a widow's peak. Over here, we're looking at the recessive trait, which is attached earlobes versus free earlobes. So here you can see that we have individuals that carry the allele for the earlobe. However, they don't actually have the recessive form. But because they're both heterozygous, they can pass it on to, in this case, their 2 sons. So what's interesting about recessive traits, and when we make pedigree charts, is we can see how those traits can skip generations because they're hidden in the heterozygous individuals. So, common human recessive disorders, albinism is one, sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, cystic fibrosis, PKU, and galactosemia are some pretty common ones that you can see in a lot of common biology textbooks. Sickle cell disease is the most common inherited disease among African Americans. You have a single amino acid substitution that results in malformed hemoglobin. So a single amino acid substitution, very small change, but that change is really profound because it reduces the amount of oxygen that can be carried by the hemoglobin. This is an example of codominant inheritance. So when you have 2 copies of the sickle cell allele, then all the hemoglobin is the sickle cell or abnormal variety. So if you have 0 copies, you have all normal cells. If you have 1 copy, then you're going to have some normal, some sickle cell. If you have 2 copies of the sickle cell allele, then all the hemoglobin is going to be the abnormal variety. The abnormal hemoglobin will crystallize when oxygen content of the blood is low, and so that's what causes the red blood cells to become sickled shape. This is just a chart that shows some of the breakdown of what happens as a result of sickle cell. So obviously down here, impaired mental function, paralysis, pneumonia, rheumatism, kidney failure. These are all some pretty serious things that can happen when you have sickle cell. Next, we've got Tay-Sachs. This is common in Eastern European Jewish populations. With Tay-Sachs, you have brain cells that are unable to metabolize a certain type of lipid that causes accumulation of that lipid in the brain. We've seen a video in class that discusses Tay-Sachs, but essentially it leads to death either in infancy or really pretty early childhood. Next, we have cystic fibrosis. This is the most common lethal genetic disease in the U.S. This is going to be most frequent in Caucasian populations. About 1 out of 20 is a carrier. It produces a defective chloride channel in membranes, so you end up with mucus buildup in the lungs as a really common symptom of that. So diseases with recessive patterns are usually rare. They're able to skip generations. Occurrence increases with consanguineous matings. Okay, so incest essentially increases the likelihood of recessive disorders. And a lot of times it's an enzyme defect. So now human dominant disorders, these are actually less common. One way to think about this is if human dominant disorders were more common than recessives, these disorders can't skip a generation. And so you would end up seeing these a lot more if they were more common than recessive disorders, just because any individual that carried even one allele would have the disorder. But some examples are Huntington's disease, achondroplasia, familial hypercholesterolemia. So these are just a couple that you will read about in the book. So with the inheritance pattern here, each affected individual had one parent that was also affected because they had at least one dominant allele that they had to get from at least one parent. So because of that, this does not skip generations the way that recessive disorders do. A lot of times homozygous cases show worse phenotype symptoms than heterozygous cases. And several of these have post-maturity onset. And so what that means, a good example is Huntington's disease. The symptoms for Huntington's don't actually start until after you would have, in most cases, had your children. And so you maybe didn't get tested for this disorder. You maybe didn't have a reason to think you needed to. And so essentially you have potentially passed on this really, really awful disease before you even knew you had it. So that is the case with Huntington's. This is an example of achondroplasia, so it's a type of dwarfism. In this case, we have the parents, one is a dwarf, one is a normal genotype, and so with this cross, you end up with the possibility of 50% of the, like a 50-50 chance of passing on dwarfism, and then 50-50 normal. So here's your lecture question for today. Do you think it makes sense that dominant human disorders are less common than recessive disorders? So please explain why or why not. So send me a message via the class website with your answer. All right, thanks guys.